You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to Social Europe podcast episode 27. My name is Henning Meyer, editor-in-chief of Social Europe. Today I'm joined by Eunice from Richmond University in London to talk about the situation of the Portuguese Socialist Party. This podcast is part of a wider project that Social Europe is running together with the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, analysing the situation of progressive parties from across the world. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Good afternoon, Eunice, and thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today about the situation of the Portuguese Socialist Party. And let's jump right into it. To give us a bit of a background, what would you say is the historic position of social democracy and the Socialist Party of Portugal in the Portuguese political system? And where does it currently stand?
Well, the Portuguese Socialist Party has had a key contribution to make to Portuguese democracy. So without the efforts of Mário Soares and of the Socialist Party, perhaps it would have taken much longer to have a democratic government in Portugal. So Portugal was at the birth of the Portuguese democracy, and thanks to its efforts, we have a consolidated democracy now in 2017. So it was those first steps were absolutely crucial. The other very big contribution that the Socialist Party has made was in anchoring Portugal in the European project, in the project of European democracies. That was a very important goal for Mário Soares, the first socialist leader, an historic prime minister and also president. And to a certain extent, the membership of the European project, being seen as a European nation, took precedent over democratic socialism or social democracy. In fact, socialist governments in Portugal in the late 1970s and early 90s imposed really painful austerity to the population with the goals of joining the European communities later on. So that has been its contribution, and this Europeanness of the Portuguese socialists is pretty fundamental and pretty important for us to understand where they are now, their positions also in the past, and also where they want to go.
Okay, and it's a party obviously in government at the moment. So what is its role against Portugal's recent votes in the wake of the Eurozone crisis, and what kind of sort of alternative policy mix has it come up with now in government?
Well, the current Prime Minister, António Costa, as a very pragmatic but also quite principled Prime Minister, was quite key in ensuring governance in Portugal and maintaining certain stability when he celebrated an agreement that allowed for a minority socialist government that is supported by two radical left-wing parties. I'm not so sure that the socialists at the moment offer really an alternative to austerity. There is a massive difference from what we had before, but Portugal is still committed to maintain certain fiscal targets. And despite the fact that the economy is growing quite fast, it's essentially economic growth in Portugal now is higher than the European average, that we've met our fiscal targets, and there has been an investment on social policy, in particular pensions, wages, and so on. There has been a price to pay in terms of investment. So António Costa has managed to create the little alternative that was possible within the very strict constraints of being part of an neoliberal monetary union.
So basically he's pushed the envelope as far as it could go within the existing framework, basically.
Exactly. That's exactly what it did. And if we look at the macroeconomic policies of his government, only 2 years, it will be soon 2 years in government, essentially there was a trade-off. So the trade-off was to stop privatizations and to invest in the social fabric. The poverty in Portugal reached really extremely high levels during the worst periods of the austerity. But the price to pay was that there was no much needed public investment. It's at the lowest level since 1995, the year before Portugal joined the European Community. So it's not a recipe for the future. It's not a recipe for a prosperous and sustainable future, because in order for the economy to grow, it needs to invest not only in infrastructure, it needs to invest in the scientific and technological fabric of the country. Within the budgetary constraints imposed by the monetary union, at the moment that is not possible.
And if we take a step back from the sort of current politics of the government and have a sort of bird's eye view of the party as such, as you know, this is part of a wider project that we are engaged in, analyzing progressive parties from across the world in terms of what is usually called the SWOT analysis in management terms. Where do you see are the particular strengths and the particular weaknesses of the Portuguese Social Democratic Party?
Well, I would start with the weaknesses because they will enable us to understand the current strengths. So the first weakness, and perhaps the main weakness of the Portuguese socialists, and this was a kind of the original sin of most social democratic parties in the 1990s, was that it accepted without questioning the neoliberal turn of the European Union. That led to, the primacy of markets over the primacy of politics at the European level. And we know where all that ended. It ended with the small state mentality that governs the monetary union, and ultimately led to extremely painful austerity that led to rising unemployment, the rise of poverty, and eventually the rise of xenophobic forces in several European countries. Gladly, Portugal escaped that trend. So that was the weakness of Portugal. Never a leader in terms of political thinking. Essentially, it followed the crowd. It followed what was and what became the dogma for European social democrats within Europe. But in terms of strengths, the socialists have also understood the limits of that dogma and started to argue for a different course, a different alternative. And this is what this particular socialist leader, now current prime minister, has been doing. And so his strength was into arriving at the right moment and making the most of it. So there was a window of opportunity for change, and he has made the most of it. He is the other strength is very effective leadership. We often forget these questions of leadership when discussing social democracy, but very often the achievement of social democratic goals is dependent on having principled but also quite effective leaders. And Antonio Costa has proved that in the domestic realm, where he managed to convince the communists and the radical left bloc to support his government. And he also has win plaudits in Brussels. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, has a very good relationship with him, and he has convinced the Brussels authorities that Portugal will meet its fiscal targets. As Portugal does that, he has argued very persuasively but very diplomatically for a different way, for reforms of the monetary union, and he is trying to build alliances. All of this takes time, but these are the necessary steps for effective and sustainable change in Europe that will favor social democratic politics.
And if you look at what kind of opportunities and threats there are for the Portuguese Social Democratic Party, maybe seen in a sort of more widely European view against the backdrop of surging populism and the threat of populist parties. So where would you pinpoint the opportunities and what particular threats there are?
The opportunities are the change of mood in Europe. There is a realization that austerity does not work, that the monetary union has to be completed and reformed. So that is the opportunity, and I think Antonio Costa is making the most of it. The threat is that him alone won't be able to change Europe. So other member states, other prime ministers and presidents of Europe, hopefully from more powerful states, will help him make the case for that change. In terms of threat, the threat, I'm afraid, is still Germany. Germany is very resistant to the idea of changing the monetary union, in particular the most harmful aspects of the monetary union, which is the governance rules of the monetary union, the Maastricht criteria and the Stability Pact that need to be reformed to allow for economic growth and for the achievement of other social goals, as opposed to only low inflation and fiscally conservative balanced budgets.
And how do you think the party should react to sort of these opportunities and the threat, for that matter, by building more coalitions across Europe and making the case, or what would you advise?
I think the advice that perhaps it can be made, taking it from the Portuguese experience, is dialogue. Is accepting that change is slow and that it will take a lot of time for change to happen, but small incremental steps can lead to radical change. I think that has been the approach of Antonio Costa. He has shown that dialogue has contributed for that change. That has happened at the national level. We should not underestimate what was achieved in 2015 in Portugal. He managed to have two parties that had vowed to never support the socialists ever in their lives. He managed to get them to support his own government. So this agreement of the lefts about what can be done and what are the limits to those ambitions is extremely important. And he has brought that approach, and I think he learned from the mistakes of Syriza, the Greek government during the height of the Eurozone crisis. He has learned that isolation leads nowhere. Essentially, Greece was extremely badly treated by the European institutions. So he has learned from there, and he has used those lessons to promote dialogue, to show that they are meeting the targets set by the European Union, that they want to comply, that they are committed to the European project, but there has to be some leeway, and we need to be able to discuss the fundamentals. And that is the opportunity these are the lessons that I think we can take from, the Antonio Costa experience.
And what is the specific circumstances in Portugal regarding populism?
Well, populism in Portugal, we can call some of the radical left parties populist, but it's a very low-key type of populism. I'm more comfortable with calling the left bloc a radical left-wing party as opposed to a populist party. And the communists, well, we don't really classify them as a populist party. So the lesson that Costa can send is that dialogues with these parties actually benefit the socialist parties, because if we look at opinion polls, the socialists in Portugal are now doing extremely well, 40%, and they're already low, 5 points below since the beginning of the summer because of the whole fires and some little scandals that have emerged. But they were 40% 2 years ago. They were on 25%. So a massive rise in popularity. On the other hand, the popularity of the radical left bloc and the communists has stagnated or declined. So the lesson here is that dialogues with the radical left, they actually benefit the social democratic parties because it humanizes those parties. It reminds them of their ideological goals. It reminds them that they're actually left-wing parties. And that leads to galvanizes voters that perhaps were somehow turned off of the electoral process.
And if you look around social democratic parties and progressive parties, even more widely across the world, there seems to be a common problem that the core constituency, or what used to be the core constituency of social democratic parties, is changing, and that the parties are struggling to connect or reconnect to their core constituency. Is this also the case in Portugal?
Well, in Portugal, like in other Southern European countries, the constituency of socialist parties has traditionally been middle class, lower middle class. The industrial working class has normally voted for the Communist Party. So the problem is less acutely felt in Southern Europe than it is, for instance, in Britain or other European countries, where social democratic parties relied essentially on the votes of the industrial working class. But this has been going on for quite a long time, since the 1970s, that there has been massive changes in European economies. So the the transformation of these economies from industrial economies into service economies. And the Social Democratic parties have paid a heavy price in terms of losing considerable votes. But I think that the lesson or the focus of Social Democratic parties should be not so much on those industrial working class, but coming to the realization that there is a class of educated left behind. Quite a big chunk of populations now with university degrees, but who are yet in insecure employment or we have great difficulties in buying a house or even finding affordable rental accommodation, who see themselves unable to start a family because life is too tough and too insecure. This is now this precariat is, I think, the new constituency for social democratic parties. And it took them a very long time to realize that this is where their future lies.
And, even though that, social democracy is doing comparatively well in Portugal, progressive parties everywhere are looking, to the future and thinking about their next sort of big political agenda. And do you see, looking internationally, any sort of role models that could provide some guidance? Some parties that have already, made more progress than others in sort of identifying what a progressive idea of the future could be?
I'm afraid there are no real role models that offer a kind of a blueprint for the future. But perhaps they don't need to draw big new blueprints because the lessons are there in the past. Social democracy did well when it remembered that it was a political project to regulate capitalism with a particular view of ensuring prosperity, democracy, and certain cosmopolitan values. I think this is what social democratic parties across Europe need to remember. They need to remember what are their values and what are their goals. They need to put politics above markets. The project of the left and the project of social democracy was always one of transforming society, not one of accepting the world as it is. And so it is remembering these roots, it's remembering what is the purpose of social democracy that its renewal lies upon. Accepting the status quo will be very detrimental. Europe has been a very big obstacle for the fulfillment of a social democratic vision, in particular the Europe of the 1990s until our days. So Europe needs to, again, also to rediscover its social vocation. We used to talk about the European social model, not anymore. This is what the European social democrats should start doing. We saw what were the dangers of ignoring the European social model, the European social vocation, and those are poverty, the brutality of austerity, and the rise of xenophobia and fascist parties across Europe. So the ingredients are there. What is needed now is real political will.
And beyond sort of reviving the idea of a social Europe and the European social model, do you see any kind of other topics that, social democracy should get its teeth in trying to sort of develop and shape the future? I mean, against the backdrop of, the digital revolution that is now coming, against the backdrop of insecure regions around European borders, refugee problems and so on and so forth. So what do you think are the big topics that require strong social democratic and progressive answers?
The deepening of democracy, that's absolutely fundamental. A deepening of democracy that will lead to a greater conscience of what being a European means. I think that will contribute vastly for the promotion of cosmopolitan values across Europe, and they are very much needed at the time. And in terms of looking at a prosperous future, that future needs to be sustainable. We need to think about our impact on the environment, and prosperity should not be done at the expense of social inclusion. So we need to have some really brave talks about work and the future of work, what it means to live in what is a good society, what should be the goals of the good society. Is it just working, being in full employment, or finding fulfilled work and other forms of happiness, work that is not paid but needs to be recognized. I think this is where it's in these issues that Europe will find the roots of its renewal.
Well, that's quite an agenda, and Eunice, so that's basically work for the next decade at least. But
and it fits the social democratic parties. You're always thinking ahead and always thinking of ways of changing and improving.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for all the suggestions that you provided in the conversation today. And I'm looking forward to catching up with you at a future date and see, how far we've gone.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.